So today we have Professor Stella Sandford talking with a lecture titled From Logic to Nature, Genus and Species in Philosophy and Biology. Stella Sandford is a professor of modern European philosophy at Kingston University. Stella completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Essex and is currently a Leverhulme Major Research Fellow researching intersex division in natural history. Her research focuses on critical philosophy of sex and more recently critical philosophy of race, especially in relation to Immanuel Kant. Stella has written a number of books, including The Metaphysics of Love, Gender and Transcendence in Levinas and Plato and Sex. Today, Stella will show how Aristotle's philosophy influenced Linnaeus' system of classification and more generally contemporary natural history. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you very much, Leanne, and thank you for coming, everybody. So I'll just give a brief contextual introduction. As you probably know, until the scientific revolution that began in the 16th century, no distinction was made between natural philosophy and what we now call science. And until then, Aristotelian philosophy was absolutely dominant in philosophy and in what we might anachronistically call the sciences. As the historian of science Stephen Gaukroger said, until the 16th century, the traditional way of dealing with natural historical and natural philosophical questions more generally was to compile a commentary on a text of Aristotle. But one of the things that characterizes the scientific revolution that began in the 16th century was precisely the rejection of Aristotelian philosophy. If we understand natural philosophy to be the attempt to give a true account of nature, or the attempt to understand the fundamental nature of things, then we could say that by the 17th century, the pioneers of modern natural history, mostly botanists, were developing a very successful practice, and in particular were developing methods and systems of classification of the natural world that ostensibly eschewed philosophical concerns, or ostensibly had nothing to do with philosophy anymore. However, many historians of natural history and writers on taxonomy would still say that, although it might have appeared that way, in fact, progress in natural history, especially if you contrast it with progress in the physical sciences, progress in natural history was, in fact, held back for a very long time by its continued reliance on certain aspects of Aristotle's philosophy, and in particular, by its reliance on Aristotle's species concept. So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about Aristotle's influence in the history of natural history, looking in particular at the way in which his logical categories of genus and species provide the basis for the modern categories of genus and species in binomial nomenclature. And I'll start by looking at those terms in Aristotle's logic, and then talk a little bit about how they figure in his zoological works, and contrast this with the modern taxonomical use of the terms genus and species, which will show us how the use of the modern terms differs from Aristotle's ancient use. But I will then show how very close Linnaeus still was to Aristotle in his understanding of the genus and the species, and in his method for the identification of genera and species, and then finally consider some other ways in which aspects of Aristotle's philosophy, which seem so remote from contemporary biology, might still be nestling at the heart of it in certain ways. So first of all, Aristotle on genus and species. In Linnaeus's library, usually kept in the vault below stairs, but today displayed in the foyer, just up the stairs there, there's a Latin translation dated 1513 of Aristotle's books on animals. This is a photograph of the first page of the book called History of Animals. Linnaeus's system of nature uses many of the classificatory groupings that Aristotle laid out in the 4th century BCE. Quadruped, for example, is a significant group for Aristotle and for Linnaeus, as you can see on the first page here. Well, you need to come close to see it, but on the first page there of Linnaeus's System of Nature from the first edition of 1735, where, interestingly, humans are included in the category quadrupeda. There's it's still rather difficult to see, but you can come and look at it afterwards. Now, Aristotle's zoological works distinguish and compare various animals and various parts of animals using, as I said, some of the terminology and methods identified in his logical works, and most obviously, they employ the logical terms genus, species, and differentia, and use those according to the rules set out in the logical work. So just for your information, there are the classical Greek words and their English in the singular and the plural, and then in their English translations. Although it's likely that Linnaeus was familiar with Aristotle's zoological works, he did after all have the book in his library, his early education would undoubtedly have included his teacher's presentations of Aristotle's logic, because in the early 18th century this was still the foundation of any European education of the kind that Linnaeus had. And it's the logic of Aristotle's concepts of genus and species, more than any application of it in his zoological works, that's most important for Linnaeus and for the natural history tradition. So in the logical works, Aristotle explains that a species is defined by giving its genus and its differentia, and that's the method of definition that comes to be known as definition per genus et differentiam. That is, according to this method, you note what something has in common with other things to determine its type, its genus, and then you find out how it differs from the other things in that same genus, which gives you its specificity, it gives you the species. And in the logical works, Aristotle often uses humans and animals as his examples, but in principle, the logic of genus and species applies to everything, including mathematical and geometrical objects, including material substances like earth and fire, as he understood them, and indeed, it must in principle extend to human-made objects like houses. So we may associate the terms genus and species primarily with natural history or with the biological sciences, but for Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition, they were first and foremost logical, philosophical terms of art. Now, Aristotle's theory of definition looks for what commentators now call the infima species. That is, it looks for a logical species which is not, because it cannot, be a genus for anything else. And for him, an example of such a species was the human. And that's the origin of the idea that the terminal category in classification is the species. According to Aristotle, it's only when we've arrived at the species that we can give a true definition of something. And that definition is not just an explanation of the meaning of the word attached to that thing. It tells us what it is to actually be that thing, what the essence of that thing is. And that is not something that can change over time. So for Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition, the very idea of a species is connected to the idea of an unchanging essence. And for Aristotle, it's always possible, although it's not necessarily easy, to give a definition that is at the same time an explanation of that essence, of the very nature or the very being of a thing. Now, following these rules, Aristotle's zoological works use the terms genus and species when grouping and comparing animals, but the terms are not taxonomic categories in a system of classification, because what for the purposes of one discussion is treated as a genus might, for the purposes of another discussion, be treated as a species of a genus. What might logically at one time be treated as a species might at another time logically be treated as a genus. His application of the logical categories of genus and species in his zoological works sometimes results in groupings of animals that we still today recognize as taxa, albeit at different levels. So he says, here's his definition right at the beginning of the book called History of Animals. By genus, I mean, for instance, bird or fish. For each of these is subject to difference in respect of its genus, and there are many species of fishes and of birds. Now, it's difficult to see this on this slide, I appreciate, but this is the page from Linnaeus's Latin translation of Aristotle, where we can see that's the Latin translation of the quotation I've just given you. And I appreciate it's difficult to see, but we can see there that how the Greek word eidos has been translated with the Latin word species. And just as a side note, when the Greek genus is translated with the Latin genus, which we take into English directly, we can see that those two words are very closely related. One is probably a transliteration of the other. But it doesn't seem to be the case with eidos and species. But the meanings connected to eidos in ancient Greek include the way a thing looks, its bodily appearance, its shape or its form. And the Latin word species comes from the verb specare, which means to look at, to see, and to behold. And from the 16th century at least, by the time of this translation, it also means appearance and outward form. So also, like the Greek, a thing seen. So, in fact, the Latin translation really does try to capture what the Greek conveys. And I mention this because we'll return to it later, the importance of the shape or the form, what you can see in the identification of a species. In the History of Animals, somewhat later, Aristotle says, these are the main genera into which animals are divided. Here's the text here. He says, they're divided into birds, fishes, and cetacea, and these are all sanguinous or blooded animals. So actually, the sanguinous animals is another genus. And then among the non-sanguinous animals, the main genera are testacea, hard-shelled animals or shellfish, crustacea, which he thinks of as soft-shelled animals, and the soft animals, like squid. And then finally, the insected animals, i.e. the insects. And he says among the rest of the animals, because you might have noticed that the land mammals were conspicuously absent from those previously lists, he says, among the rest of the animals, there are no large genera. There are only simple species, for example, horse, dog, human, and so on. Now, because, for Aristotle, the species is always a subdivision of the genus, it looks like he uses the terms in the same way that we do now in contemporary natural history. But Aristotle also uses the word genus quite liberally to designate any relatively large group which can be further subdivided. So, for example, here we see him in the Latin translation from the book that Linnaeus owned, referring to the quadrupeds as a genus, or the genus of quadrupeds. And here we see him referring to the genus, the huge genus of inanimate things, and also, interestingly, the genus of plants. So although a genus for Aristotle is a natural grouping in that it does group things of the same nature, it's not a random grouping. It is still primarily for him a logical category, and the genus-species relation is still for him primarily a logical one. Now, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the pioneers of scientific natural history were searching for a natural method of classification. And we can understand this search for a natural method of classification as the attempt to transform Aristotle's logical categories of genus and species into natural categories, or to transform that logical genus-species relation into a natural genus-species relation, or a series of natural genus-species relations. And from that moment, genus and species in natural history would no longer function as relative logical terms, but would designate fixed ranks or levels in a hierarchical system. So whereas for Aristotle, a given group, for example, quadrupeds, could in principle be thought either as a species, for example, a species of the genus Sanguinus animals, or quadrupeds could be thought of as a genus itself containing several species, this isn't possible in modern taxonomy. In modern taxonomy, what is, for example, identified as a species could never in principle, under any circumstance, also be identified as a genus. The words have now come to have a determined technical meaning in a scientific discourse, which they didn't have for Aristotle. And, of course, fixing the logical categories of genus and species as taxonomic ranks makes it possible to construct a stable system of classification where everything has, as it were, a fixed abode. It won't keep moving round according to the purposes of the discussion. But it doesn't, of course, solve the problem of identifying particular genera and species in the plant and animal worlds. In itself, fixing the taxonomical categories doesn't tell us what the content of our generic and specific groupings should be. So in the 16th and 17th century, naturalists were then trying to identify natural, generic groups to serve as a fixed layer of reality that would be the basis for a systematic and comprehensive classification of all natural entities, which, of course, is where Linnaeus comes in. Although others before Linnaeus had asserted the centrality of the category of the genus in classification, it was in his theoretical statements and his development and popularization of the binomial system of classification, or he popularized it, and it's mostly associated with his name, so we think of him as introducing it, but he didn't introduce the taxonomic ranks or the binomial system, but he certainly did the most to popularize them. So Linnaeus is part of that movement from logic to nature, we could say. But in this move, Aristotle's philosophy is certainly not left behind in Linnaeus's works. It's not just the words genus and species that Linnaeus takes from Aristotle, but also something of their philosophical content. And we can see this by looking at how Linnaeus conceived the genus and the species. And for that, the best place to look is his book called Philosophia Botanica, which was first published in 1751. And again, his copy from the library vault is on display in the cabinet on the stairs as you go up to the other library. In Philosophia Botanica, Linnaeus says that the search for the natural method is the beginning and the end of what is needed in botany. And for him, the natural method means the way to identify the natural genera. He explains that we identify genera by noting the similarities in the fruit bodies of various plants. And he says that there are as many genera as there are similarly constructed fruit bodies produced by natural species. So the species group also, for him, was natural. He says, we reckon the number of species as the number of different forms that were created in the beginning. Further, he says, the concept of a species consists of an essential feature by which alone it is distinguished from all others in the same genus. And this essential feature is its specific difference, or the differentia specifica, as it says here. So this is a photograph of a page from Philosophia Botanica. So unlike Aristotle, Linnaeus restricts the category of genus, giving it a place as a taxonomical category in a hopefully natural system based on the fruit bodies of plants, so that only these groups of plants with similarly constructed fruit bodies can now be called plant genera. For Linnaeus, it would make absolutely no sense to speak of the genus of plants as Aristotle had done earlier. It makes perfect logical sense for Aristotle, makes no sense at all for Linnaeus. However, we can see that Linnaeus's conception of a species is exactly that of Aristotle's infamous species, the only thing that can be said to have an essence. And Linnaeus' way of determining the species within a genus is exactly that of Aristotle, definition per genus et differentiam. And Aristotle's method of definition per genus et differentiam is not just a matter of logic, it's also a matter of metaphysics, because it's not just about the logical relations between things, but the identification of the level at which something can be said to have an essence, what he calls a substance. That is the identification of a kind of being rather than just a quality of a kind of being. To me, it seems really remarkable that this aspect of Aristotle's logic and his metaphysics from the 4th century BCE should have played such a central part in the development of natural history and still be doing the fundamental work in Linnaeus' natural history, and indeed to still be embedded in the system of binomial nomenclature today. So even if, as we'll see, science has to go beyond this metaphysical way of thinking about things, it remains the case that there would be no natural history as we know it without this philosophy, without Aristotle's philosophy. Now, of course, in contemporary biology, genera and species are obviously no longer understood in the way that Linnaeus understood them. No taxonomical category is now thought to have a real or essential characteristic. And most importantly, the species is no longer thought of as conceived, was no longer conceived in an essentialist way. It's no longer thought of as fixed. This is why some, like the paleontologist Gaylord Simpson, objected to the continued use of type specimens in the natural sciences. According to Simpson, the reverence for type specimens perpetuates the old Aristotelian, i.e. essentialist, approach to classification. Now, as we know, different and competing species concepts exist today, and different concepts are appropriate for different parts of the natural world, but species are now predominantly conceived as genealogical entities, and identification is made generally by way of genome analysis. So modern biology has obviously gone far beyond the idea that species is something seen, something visible, something identified by the morphology of the thing. And now we know that morphology can indeed be very misleading. So here's a slide from the natural history display in the Ulster Museum teaching us that the brachiopods, which look so similar to the bivalves, are in fact far more closely related to the bryozoans, which they resemble very little. Of course, morphological similarity does sometimes indicate evolutionary relation and was used by Darwin as an argument in favour of evolution. And so, as you probably know, biologists distinguish between homologous structures like these bones here in the forelimbs of these animals, and analogous structures, that is, structures that have evolved in different animals to perform similar functions, but where those animals have no common ancestor, like the wings of insects and the wings of birds. It's perhaps less well known, however, that we owe this distinction between homology and analogy to Aristotle too. He distinguished between the differences that obtain between the species of a genus, which he called differences of the more or less, or differences of degree, and differences that obtain between things that belong to different genera. And things that belong to different genera, he said, can only be compared analogously. He, for example, thought that nail and hoof and hand and claw were only analogous structures, whereas we understand them to be homologous. But granted that we conceive the natural groups differently, we owe to Aristotle as well the basic principle that functional similarities across natural groups are to be understood as analogues. He was specific about that, with functional similarities. Now, I've already mentioned Gaylord Simpson, who was an important contributor to the development of evolutionary theory in the second half of the 20th century, and incidentally was awarded the Linnean Medal by the Linnean Society in 1962. And he really had it in for Aristotle. He strongly criticised the legacy of Aristotelian essentialism in taxonomy, as others did actually, and the Aristotelian method of definition per genus et differentiam. And in his book, The Principles of Animal Taxonomy in 1961, he said, the study of Aristotle can only increase ignorance. Now, with all due respect to Simpson, I beg to differ. What he says would only be true if there was nothing to be gained from studying and understanding the philosophical history behind some of the fundamental concepts of natural history. And such a study might, for example, reveal, if anything, of the philosophical presumptions of ages past were not still operating surreptitiously in today's concepts and ways of proceeding. And you know, for some people, the study of the origin of the concepts of genus and species shows precisely that the modern species concept is still in some way mortgaged surreptitiously to this essentialist way of thinking about things. One other avenue that might usefully be explored is the legacy of the fact that early botany, following Aristotle and his contemporaries, was based on a series of analogies between animals and plants, which is still very much in evidence in the terminology of modern botany. So we say plants have veins, for example, though they have no blood. We talk about the ovary of a plant, although it does not produce a gamete or an egg directly. And this terminology, some of it comes directly from Aristotle and Aristotle's contemporary Theophrastus. There are probably very few botanists who would think that a good understanding of plant life ought to be based on analogies with animals, and yet the analogy with animal sex is still the model for the understanding of pollination. What if that were as much of an outdated philosophical presupposition as the essentialist conception of species that dominated biology for so long? That, however, is a question to be explored another time. Thank you.